It's time for another Theology Crash Course. I'm your host, John Moody. In today's premiere episode, we'll take a look at the question, what is theology? After all, if we're going to do a crash course on something, it's probably a good idea to define our terms from the outset. Luckily, we're used to seeing words that end in O-L-O-G-Y. For example, biology, the study of living things, or geology, the study of the earth and rocks and other hard bits that make up the planet, or psychology, the study of the psyche or soul, or otorhinolaryngology, which is the study of the ear, nose, and throat. But you knew that, didn't you? So you see the pattern here. Theology, we must conclude, is the study of theos, which is the Greek word for God. Theology is simply the study of God. Really, it's that simple. Theology answers questions like this. Is there a God? If there is a God, what is this God like? What has this God done? What is this God doing now? What does this God promise to do in the future? And most importantly, how does God relate to us? Does God have things he expects of us? Does he have things he wants us to do or things that he wants us not to do? If there is a God, it seems like that would be an important thing to know, right? So theology answers questions like that. Now, if theology is the study of God, we have a bit of a problem because God is a big subject, really big. And this is a crash course, not an exhaustive study. We don't have the millions of years it would take to study God in complete detail. So since we can't cover everything there is to know about God, we need to narrow our focus down a bit. And one way we're going to do that in this crash course is by focusing on Christian theology. We're going to limit our focus on the Christian conception of God as found in the Bible. We're not going to look at Jewish theology, or Muslim theology, or Hindu theology, or even atheist theology. Yes, there is such a thing. Atheists have ideas about God too. We're going to focus in this crash course on what Christians believe and teach about God. But even then, there's still an impossibly huge amount of stuff to cover, and we need a plan of attack. Well, luckily for us, as they say in the South where I grew up, there's more than one way to skin a cat. There's more than one way to get this job done, to approach the study of God. You know, that's a horrible saying. Okay, for the record, no cats will actually be harmed in any way in this crash course. Sorry I brought it up. Where was I? Oh, right, more than one approach to doing theology. And very large, very thick books have been written using each of these three approaches that we're going to look at. For example, one approach is called biblical theology. Biblical theology works by tracing a theme through the scriptures in chronological order. Let's say we're trying to study a particular idea in theology. For example, let's use the idea of mankind as bearing the image of God. Now, if we're going to study this using a biblical theological method, we're going to look at what Genesis has to say about man being created in the image of God. And then we're going to look at what the books of Moses had to say, Genesis through Deuteronomy, the Pentateuch. And then we'll look at what the historical books and the prophetic books of the Old Testament and the wisdom literature has to say about mankind being bearers of God's image. And then we'd look at the Gospels and the ministry of Jesus and learn what Jesus had to teach us about bearing the image of God. And then we'd look at Acts and the letters of Paul and the other epistles and the book of Revelation and see how the early church understood this idea of bearing the image of God. You get the idea. We're taking a chronological approach. And by doing so, the big advantage of this approach is that you stay very closely tethered to Scripture. The disadvantage, unfortunately, is that sometimes you can get so focused in on the minutia that you can't see the forest for the trees. So if you're trying to understand the image of God in a comprehensive way, biblical theology is helpful for seeing the development of a doctrine, but it's not necessarily as useful for getting that big picture, comprehensive view. That's where systematic theology comes into play. Systematic theology pulls all of the information on a theme together in an ordered, logical, topical fashion. So, for example, if you were looking at the image of God, to use our example from the last slide, what you do in systematic theology is you would pull from the entire scriptures everything that the Bible has to say about being in the image of God and what that means, and organize it in a topical, logical fashion. And the advantage to that approach, of course, is that it keeps the big picture in view. The disadvantage is that if you're not careful, it becomes really easy to take individual scriptures and rip them out of their context and thereby skew their meaning somewhat. So you have to be really careful when you're doing systematic theology that you're looking at the scriptures, the individual verses that you're pulling these doctrines from, and you're making sure that they're in context, that they're not being distorted and ripped away from their original context, their original meanings. Now, there's a third way to do theology, and that's called historical theology. Historical theology is a little bit different because it traces the understanding of a theme not through the scriptures themselves, but throughout church history. So, for example, if we're taking the image of God as our example again, we would look at what the early church fathers thought about being in the image of God. What did they have to say about that? And then we'd look at what a great theologian like Augustine had to say about being in the image of God, and the medieval theologians. We'd look at what Aquinas had to say, and then moving into the Reformation, what Luther and Calvin and the Reformers had to say. And as we're moving into the modern era, we'd look at what did the Puritans have to say about the image of God? What did the liberal German theologians of the last 150 years have to say about it? What do modern theologians have to say about it? What did people like C.S. Lewis or Francis Schaeffer have to say about the image of God? So you get the idea. It's still that chronological approach, but instead of looking at the chronology of redemptive history in the Bible, you're looking at the development of our understanding of a doctrine from the early church through to today. So, which approach is best? Honestly, that's not the best question to ask because they're all useful approaches, and each of them has its place. In this course, we're going to be using primarily a systematic theology approach. We'll be moving through theological ideas in a semi-logical, topically based fashion. But we'll be doing bits of biblical theology and some historical theology as we go. You don't have to stay isolated in just one approach. You can borrow liberally as needed, and that's what we'll be doing in this course. Now, you might be looking at all of this and getting a little bit intimidated. That's understandable. You might be thinking, theology is what academic people do, and that's not me. I'm not a bookworm. I don't read books like this. I don't read these books that have 1,000 pages in them. Okay, except for that one Harry Potter novel, but we're not going to talk about that, right? Well, I understand your intimidation, but let me clue you in on a little secret. If you think that theology's not for you, everyone does theology. We are all theologians. Whether you're trained as a theologian or not, whether you have a Bible school or seminary degree or not, we all have ideas and convictions about God. It doesn't matter how educated or uneducated you are, how new of a Christian or how advanced of a Christian, or whether you're a Christian at all, we all have ideas and convictions about God. We are all theologians. The problem is that so much theology that's out there is untethered from what God has revealed about himself in the Bible. And that's why this course exists. If you're going to do theology anyway, why not do it well? Thanks for watching. To see more Theology Crash Course videos, visit our website at theologycrashcourse.com. And while you're there, make sure to sign up for the mailing list so you'll be the first to know when new content is available.